Good morning. I'm Towne Bannon. I'm at home in San Diego, and I'm ready to talk about the rock. It's one of my favorite subjects. So, all right, let's start. Question number one, what is the history concerning the rock? Well, the history of the rock is largely unknown. For one thing, nobody knows the basic history. We don't know who carved the Indian head or when, and we don't know why they carved it. Maybe Native Americans in ancient times, some kind of religious or cultural significance. Maybe early European settlers to mark a specific spot on the river. Maybe it was just somebody doodling on some lazy summer afternoon. Early 19th century, maybe a quarryman. All we really know is around the middle of the 19th century, people began to go there and to the swimming hole nearby and take a picnic, lunch, and as part of the entertainment, when there wasn't much, would carve their names and initials on the rock. Then at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the government decided to deepen the channel of the Ohio River for steamboat traffic, so they built dams, and the water came up and the rock disappeared. Late in the summer of 1920, the downstream dam broke. So the water level went down, and at least the tip of the rock came back up above water briefly, long enough to get a photograph of the face. But the dam was soon repaired, and the rock was lost again until Steve Schaefer found it a year ago and took it to Portsmouth. The Indian head itself had not been seen in over a century at that point. And question number two, what is the Bannon family's association with Portsmouth? Well, the Bannon association with Portsmouth is a long one in the first place. There were Bannons living in Portsmouth for over 150 years. My great-great-grandfather, Edward Bannon, he was born in Ireland in the year 1800, and he became a carpenter. And his future wife, Bridget Derwin, was born in Dublin in the year 1820. They got married in 1837 and sailed the same day for the New World. I try to imagine that wedding. Everybody would have been there. This was in the parish church, of course, of her parents' parish. Everybody would have been there. His parents, his brothers and sisters, all of his friends from rural Ireland, and all of her family would have been there. A large group of people. So the ceremony, and at the end of the ceremony, the whole group troops down to the waterfront, and Edward and Bridget get on a sailing ship and leave for the New World. I can hardly imagine this scene. Edward and Bridget had to know at that time that there was a very great chance that they would never again see their parents or their brothers and sisters or any of their friends, and as a matter of fact, they never did. These are remarkably gutsy people. I don't mean just Edward and Bridget. I mean all of those people first half of the 19th century who sailed out of Europe for the New World, leaving behind every single human contact of their lives, headed for a place that they hardly understand, but that they sense somehow has opportunities for them that they don't have where they are. For economic lives much better for themselves and for their children. It's a gutsy bunch of people. We ought to be glad that they were so remarkable. At any rate, Edward and Bridget arrived in 1837 in April, and in 1841 they had a son named James. James became a lawyer, a successful lawyer, and later a judge, and he had three sons. Sometimes they're called the three Bannon boys. It was Henry, Arthur, and James Jr. Two of them became lawyers, and one was a banker. Henry was also elected to Congress for a while. Henry also had, they all had children, but all of the other children left Portsmouth. Henry had a son, Louis Bannon, who was my father. He stayed in Portsmouth. He also became a lawyer. There's some evidence here that becoming a lawyer is a genetic disease. At any rate, he stayed in Portsmouth, practiced law all his professional life, and finally died in Hillview in 1991. And at that time, the Bannon name disappeared out of the Portsmouth phone book. Okay, and question number 3. What did you know or hear about the Rock growing up? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I have no specific memory of something that somebody told me when I was a child, except sit up straight and don't talk with your mouth full. Sunday dinners, though, were a kind of ritual, a mandatory ritual at my grandfather's house at noon on Sunday, every Sunday. And the conversation would often be my father and my grandfather talking about the old days. So somehow in all that, I don't remember how or at what time, but at some time during all that, I began to absorb the idea of the Rock, at least the basic facts of it, the fact that the Rock existed and that people used to go there and put their names on the Rock, and that now the Rock was underwater and nobody knew where it was. Later, I read my grandfather's book, Stories Old and Often Told. I wish I had read it while he was still alive. I certainly would have liked to talk to him about it, but my interest in the Rock came later, came too late, as a matter of fact. And question number 4, why did your grandfather write Stories Old and Often Told? And explain it. Well, my grandfather wrote stories old and often told because he loved history. He was absolutely fascinated by it. Writing a book about it was simply a natural for him, and he was a good writer. He must have loved the research, and he did a lot of it. It really talks about Scioto County from the beginning. I mean, prehistoric geology and Indian times, the French explorers and the British settlers, over the natural environment, the forests and the plants and the birds and the big game, all that, all the way down to industrial development in the 20th century. It's thorough. I wish he and Steve Schaefer could have met. Their mutual fascination with history would have made them great friends. That would have been very nice. Sorry it didn't happen. And question number 5, is there special that you would like to share about the book Stories Old and Often Told, written by your grandfather? Yes, there is a detail about Stories Old and Often Told that I'd like to share. It's a little history about the history book. My grandfather first wrote a book called Scioto Sketches. This is a copy of it right here. It was published in 1920 at his own expense, I think, because he didn't expect it to be very popular, and I guess publishers didn't either. He mostly, I think, intended to be for, gifts and maybe kind of an ego thing. But Portsmouth High School began to use it as a textbook. His aunt, Mary Mulligan, was a teacher at Portsmouth High School, and that may have helped get his book used. At any rate, the book began to catch on locally and began to sell pretty well, and a Baltimore publisher picked it up. So grandfather tweaked it here and there and added a few things, and a new version of the old book came out in 1927 under the title Stories Old and Often Told.
3.
6. There are 5 theories. Which one do you believe is the most possible theory? I'm guessing here that we're talking about theories on why the Indian head face was carved on the rock. I can't think of 5. I only can think of 3. One of them was that the Native Americans had carved it in prehistoric days. There was one theory that thieves carved it to identify the spot in the river where they had buried a treasure. And the third was that a quarryman had done it in pioneer days. My grandfather certainly favored the first of those. He felt absolutely sure that the Indian head was the work of an Indian artist, that it had an Indian feel to it, and that it resembled other art of the period in that area. And I'll defer to him because I don't know anything about that. My own only exposure to Indian art has been in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, and it's not, that art is not at all like the carving on the rock. Certainly the middle one of those two, that thieves had carved it to mark the spot for a buried treasure, seems like romantic nonsense. That's surely the least likely of the three. But the last one, the idea that a quarryman might have done it in pioneer days, my mind likes to play with that idea of a quarryman on that warm, lazy Sunday afternoon just doodling on the rock. It seems to me it's even possible that his initials were EDC. The initials EDC, which are very professionally cut into the rock, obviously by a professional, are just under the carving of the head and just to the right, in exactly the place that an artist would sign his work if that were being done. It's almost as if the quarryman might have just doodled this, you know, kind of funny face and then signed it with this perfect signature. At any rate, maybe it was EDC who carved the rock. Who knows? And number 7, how did you come to learn about the rock's discovery and recovery? Well, I learned about the rock's discovery and recovery by a fall out of the blue from Steve Schaefer, whom I had never heard of and never met. Steve Schaefer told me, introduced himself, and told me that he had learned about the rock from a textbook that he had in the 6th grade that was written by my grandfather, and had become fascinated by the rock and its mysteries. At that point, the rock had not been seen by anyone for 50 years. It had been submerged. He began, I guess, to dream that maybe someday somebody could find it, that he might be able to find it someday. My grandfather's name, my grandfather who wrote the book, was Henry Towne Bannon, and I was named after him. I'm also Henry Towne Bannon, and I guess because of that, Steve Schaefer was looking in the internet and found my name and somehow phone number and got in touch with me. Introduced himself and told me that he and some friends had found the rock, brought it to the surface, got it to Portsmouth. I was just blown away. All right. 8. How did you feel when you received that news? Well, I felt excited. I felt delighted. I left Portsmouth 60 years ago. This was an adventure for me, getting back into my past. I mean, a chance to reconnect with my own history and with Portsmouth history, and the idea of the rock, which has always been fascinating to me. Its importance to Portsmouth, its connection with Portsmouth history. The whole idea of the rock and the Indian head is kind of irresistible. And number 9, what do you think about all the media attention? Well, I think the media attention has been really helpful. It's an outsider's perspective on the dispute. The pursuit of an ancient artifact by an amateur historian is an easy and certainly attractive story to tell. And it's pretty difficult to make it sound evil. And 10, what do you think about Steve Schaefer and the others being indicted? Well, I think it's a sad business. It must be obvious to anybody reasonable that Steve Schaefer and his friends had no intent or idea of stealing Kentucky property. Disturbing an archaeological site or, grand larceny, come on. What you have here is an amateur historian who learned about all this in the 6th grade and dreamed of finding it so that Portsmouth could have a link back to its past. And he did find it 16 feet down at the bottom of the Ohio River in deep mud, and he brought it up to the light and got it to Portsmouth. Meanwhile, nobody in Kentucky had any interest in finding or retrieving the rock, as far as I know. South Shore people looking for it, not that I know of. Was anybody in Kentucky showing even a slight curiosity about where the rock was, or what condition was it in? Was the current of the river eroding the carvings on the rock? Not as far as I know. Were politicians in Frankfurt appropriating dollars to the rock and retrieve it? Certainly not that I know of. Was anyone in Kentucky discussing the importance of the rock? Not that I know of. Well, we know how important the rock was to Kentucky. When they first learned that the rock had been found and taken to Portsmouth, they demanded that the rock be returned so they could throw it back in the river. And question number 11. How did you feel when you learned there was a drive to put the rock back into the river? Well, how would anybody feel? I mean, you just roll your eyes. My guess is that the people in Kentucky will realize pretty soon how absurd that demand sounds, and that they'll change the demand to something that they can say with a straight face. And 12. Who do you believe should have possession of the rock, and why? Well, Portsmouth should have possession of the rock. It's my hometown. Actually, there are more compelling reasons than that. The names on the rock are Portsmouth people. Portsmouth is the population center for the area. If the rock is there, more people will see it. Portsmouth has a long history of caring about the rock. Kentucky does not. On that note, I was rummaging around the internet, I think yesterday or the day before, and I found that my grandfather had written a report to the Ohio Historical Society about the significance of the rock and its location, and he included a photo of the Indian head, which he and his brother had just taken in 1920. And it was published by the Ohio Historical Society in a publication of theirs called the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society Quarterly. It was volume 30, number 1, published in January of 1921. That was 65 years before Kentucky got around to designating the area as part of the first archaeological district of Kentucky. And number 13, what does this rock represent to the city of Portsmouth? Well, the rock represents a number of things to the city of Portsmouth. Pride in its own history, for one thing. It represents a kind of tangible connection with Portsmouth's past, a kind of touchstone, if you will. It certainly can be a powerful educational tool to teach children. And it's also a direct message from our ancestors that if you and everybody else in town is willing to work like hell and sacrifice for a while with a common goal, a well thought out common goal, that you can make a city grow, make it prosper. The other thing it represents, the rock, strangely enough, is a clear example of the kinship between Ohio and Kentucky. I mean, now, just like in the 19th century, Kentucky is our closest neighbor. My great-grandmother was from South Shore. Ohio and Kentucky were kids together. They grew up together. Maybe the politicians need to sit down and talk, not in a courtroom. It's neutral, maybe over some of that good bourbon. See what compromises are possible. Ohio and Kentucky are a family. One idea off the top of my head, maybe Portsmouth could offer land and a building on the Ohio side for a Kentucky Welcome Center. I know that sounds nuts. Just north of the bridge. The Welcomes play the rock, for one thing. The Welcome Center would be managed and manned by Kentucky people who could answer questions and give travelers information about Kentucky facilities and points of interest. Not only that, such a thing would be so unusual. As far as I know, it would be the only case like that in the United States, where one state has a welcome center across the river from its border in another state. It would be a kind of symbol of cooperation between two old neighbors. And 14. What do you think your grandfather would think of all the media controversy? I think my grandfather would have relished the media controversy and he would have played it for all it was worth. And the last question, number 15. Is there anything you would like the public to know concerning the rock? Yes, there really is something I'd like to pass on about the rock. All those names on the rock are 19th century people. And it's not as if each of those names or set of initials was an island by itself. These are all people that knew each other. They and their families had been around Portsmouth for a long time. Everybody was familiar with everybody else. There must have been endless intersections between all of those people. I mean, friendships and feuds, insults and flattery, secret love affairs, snobbery and grudges and kindnesses and every variety of human behavior imaginable. There's an example from my own family history that let me pass on. One side of the rock has the name F. Kinney. I think F. Kinney was the son of Colonel Peter Kinney. That probably sounds familiar. The other side of the rock has the initials of the three Bannon boys, the sons of old James Bannon. Old James Bannon, when he was a young man, awkward way to say it, as a young man, James wanted to start a law firm and buy a house and marry his girlfriend, but he didn't have any money. So he joined the Union Army, went off to the Civil War with the idea of saving his money and bringing it back and being able to do some of those things when he got home. After the war, sure enough, he returned to Portsmouth. He opened a law office, married his girlfriend, and he bought a piece of land called Kinney's Pasture up near the incredible Kinney Mansion, up above Kinney's Lane. He and his wife built a really modest house there, and there was enough land so that they could have a garden and grow things and put them up for the winter, anything to save money. Starting a law practice is a slow business, and they needed to be careful. Just the other day, I found some notes of my grandfather's about that period. This was the house that my grandfather was born into in 1867, I believe. At any rate, this is from my grandfather. Home was a humble one. My father was a struggling lawyer whose earnings were meager. His office was 2 miles from his home, and he was too poor to own a horse and buggy. Excuse me. All the food for the family, except what he raised in a garden, he carried home in a basket. A rich man, Colonel Peter Kinney, a banker, lived nearby. He drove a team back and forth to his office every day, passing my grandfather, ever stopping to offer him a ride. That amazes me. I'll have to just find my place now. When he died, this is Colonel Peter Kinney, when he died many years later, he left a complicated estate, and the family relied on Father, that's James Sr., on Father's skill to salvage some of it. Colonel Kinney was a stubborn Britisher. He was a long-time member of All Episcopal Church, but he fell out with the congregation and withdrew with some friends, and they built a new church, which they called Christ Church. The rest of the villagers called it Kinney Christ and Company. Colonel Kinney lived in much style in a mansion built from plans that he had acquired in Italy. After the Civil War, He set a small cannon on the brow of the hill and fired a salute to the sun each evening as it dropped behind the western hills. That's living in style. This is the stuff of those great English novels of the 19th century. I mean, this is Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. This is masterpiece theater stuff. If we only knew all of those intersections between all of those people on that rock, we'd have enough novels to keep ourselves fascinated for years. And we might even have some psychological studies as well. Hey, this has been fun. Thanks a lot. Stay in touch and take care of that rock.